So I wanted to start off by kind of bringing some context to this. When we talk about public safety, the public safety contracts, including police, EMS, and fire, make up, I think, roughly 70% of our city's budget. And I think the police contract is about 40%. So this is, a big discussion when we talk about the budget, about the kind of money that the city spends, but also just, on a personal level in terms of interactions that citizens have with police. So I wanted to introduce our four guests today. First, we have Kathy Mitchell with the Austin Justice Coalition, and Kathy's been working on their policy team for about 2 years now. And Austin Justice Coalition, if you don't know, advocates on education, policing, civic engagement, and community building with people of color and other marginalized people in our community. So thank you so much, Kathy, for being here. Next to Kathy, we have Nelson Linder, who has been the president of the local NAACP chapter for roughly 18 years. So thanks so much, Nelson, for being here. And then next to Nelson, we have Andrew Romero, who's the vice president of the Austin Police Association, the police union, and he represents over 1,900 men and women who serve as our local police officers. And then next to Andrew, we have Ron DeLorde, who is a leading public safety union contract negotiator, an attorney, and an expert on police and fire unions in the country. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here. So I wanted to start off whenever I'm reporting on what's called the meet and confer or the police contract, I often have to take a step back and say, do people even know how this works? Do people even know that the way we dictate pay or discipline is actually renegotiated every 3 or 4 years, and it's a contract that exists between the union and the city? So I wanted to kind of just begin with how we understand how this works and kind of ask each of our panelists to, all of you have a different stake in this. So what are some of the things you think the public should know about the contract and how these negotiations work? And why does this document matter to the public? So if we could start with Kathy and maybe just go down the line.
So in our conversations with all kinds of people, I think the big thing people don't understand is that Austin's current or most recent police oversight system, civilian oversight system, was a creature of the contract. That if there were issues with it, it had to wait until the renegotiation. If we have a 5-year contract, that means we wait 5 years until we can really debate how that system works. I think most people feel like their elected officials have, the responsibility for that, and are surprised at the structure that we're in.
It starts with the word meet and confer, which is a very broad term. And what it means is that we meet and we confer. We communicate about these issues to bring in accountability. Let me just add that this evolved from an era of police and community conflict back in prior to 2000. And so during that period of time, there was almost no communication. There were shootings that were not being addressed at all. So people like the Black Citizen Task Force and Captain Lloyd White, who was a policeman, by the way, Freddie Maxwell, said, wait, we've got to fix this. Let's get a process where we can have some sort of civilian oversight, bring folks to the table, and actually communicate. And so in 2002, this became a reality. And the first case addressed was Sophia King, and they called for an independent investigation. So I would say, rather than just talk about the term, we have to always address the context, the history, and why it evolved in the first place. And in doing that, we get a greater understanding. It's not a police contract entirely. It involves the entire community, especially the organization like us, NACP, and we try to communicate in a civil manner when necessary, and that's most of the time, to make the city better and make sure people understand. And in result is we want to have a city that does not discriminate, and we're trying to eradicate discrimination and also eliminate disparities in the process based on structural, systemic, and individual racism.
I would like to build on what Kathy and Nelson have said so far, which is to understand what the contract is, you have to know that it has existed for almost 20 years and it has evolved over time. And I think when we had our first contract, the department was a much different department than it is today. And I think the contract is attributable to why we have such a better department than we did 20 years ago. I think that the transparency and oversight that was contained in the contract has made our department much more professional today than it was. And the association has always embraced transparency and oversight. I think we were ahead of the rest of the state. We're still ahead of the rest of the state, and we're arguably have one of the best transparency and oversight systems in the country. Now, having said that, we're absolutely willing to go out there and explore what exists in the United States to see if, while we had our heads down doing our jobs here in Austin, Texas, maybe transparency and oversight evolved, and there's something that could make our department even better.
Yeah. I've been around about 50 years in the union business, and I've seen the evolution. I started as a police officer in 1969, and at the time, and Nelson could tell you, we had segregated schools. I went to segregated school. African Americans had their own school system. So in just my lifetime, we've seen this evolution to people today think, well, how's that possible? Well, of course it's possible. And we've evolved, and the police have evolved. Well, in many ways, public pressure down, pressure politically is in the quality of policing that we have today. And what Meet and Confer has done, it lets everyone have a discussion. And while it's the agent of the police, the association, sitting down with the city management, in the end, the officers have to ratify and have a buy-in. The city council has to vote and have a buy-in. The council listens then to the voters and community groups in making their decisions. And in the end, what we hope to have is a process of both discipline and promotions and hiring and oversight that both the officers understand what the rules are and they have a fair system, and the public believes that they have a fair system. Is there a perfect system? We haven't seen it. But in this process, we now, regardless of what's happened, we have an opportunity to start from scratch, and that's where we're at. And I've stated that at this point, we're listening to whatever is brought to the table. Whether the oversight process is in the contract or out of the contract is not going to be our decision. It's a decision of the council, it's a decision of the groups. We would like to have it be a negotiated process because we want the 1,900 officers to also have a buy-in in the process.
And Ron, we were talking earlier, you've sat in on a lot of these negotiations in other cities. Just logistically, I mean, how long do these usually take? As I think you mentioned, there's, the city representative there, a union representative, you are there. These are, I believe, closed meetings. Can you kind of just lead us through the logistics of how this works?
Yeah. There are public meetings in Texas. We're one of the states that has a sunshine law. It's hard to say. If people keep mentioning publicly, well, it's going to take a year. I don't think it's going to take a year. A lot of the things of which we had resolved at the table are already resolved. They're not of contention among the public. Hiring, we've taken a very enlightened view. We believe the city ought to have the ability to seek out the best men and women and make them a job offer. We don't think it ought to be encumbered by rules that exclude people. We had a very enlightened promotional process, and we've worked those things out with the city already. So really what we're talking about now, what's the disciplinary system and what's the oversight system? And those two, and what's fair compensation? So I think those things might take a few months. It could take 5 or 6 months, but it doesn't have to. So we're not going back to scratch because a lot of the procedural things are things of which there's no public concern. They've been resolved between the association and the employer.
Something that strikes me about the fact that we renegotiate these every 3, 4, 5 years is that it's a chance for the city and the public to rethink its values when it comes to policing. So I wanted to ask, each of you who feel like you can talk about this, but, how do you think the community's values have changed over time? And if so, what do you feel like they are now? Kathy, do you want to start?
Yes, I actually think we are in a time of change with respect to criminal justice across the board and policing in specific. We are at a time, we are at the, perhaps not even the bottom of a decades-long drop in crime. We're at a time where the public in general is having very robust dialogue about who we should jail and why, and what amount of our tax dollars should be allocated to that large area, and whether there are alternatives to arrest and jail for many of the people who are currently being arrested and put in jail. And I think that that larger discussion, when it comes around to the police contract, it opens up a conversation about how we staff public safety in general, what are our priorities for the men and women who we have hired to do that, and if our priorities and our values around public safety are starting to shift, how is that reflected in the dialogue around the contract? I think that for a lot of us who've been working on this time around, the starting point, of course, is de-escalation and reducing shootings. I think it's a little known fact that, or a little known statistic, shall I say, that Austin has a pretty high rate of police shootings per capita compared to other cities. There are some other indicators where I think we're feeling like Austin may not be where we should be. And so the police contract, while it's not the whole solution to all of those problems, it is a piece of the solution. So if we're going to, as we did in this city, we recently changed our police manual to institute a policy of de-escalation. That is a very important step for this city. If that policy of de-escalation is then going to be taken meaningfully forward, so that if officers are not de-escalating, then there is some consequence. That's the piece that becomes part of the dialogue in the contract. How does that work, and how does the community have a trust in the outcome? So in terms of values, yeah, I think that's how I would describe it.
I want to again cite a historical context. De-escalation is not a new word. We've had it in Austin since 2004. So it's not necessarily a policy, it's what you enforced. Let me give you a little context. In 2002, I read an article from the Human Rights Watch called Shielded from Justice, Police Accountability. This is 2002. I was given to it when I became vice president. And so there are various barriers to accountability. It's not just civilian oversight. In fact, it's probably the least significant. Things like DAs, do they prosecute folks when they violate the law? That's the strongest arm of justice. All these parts make the whole. All these parts play a very important role. You know, when I became vice president, the black police officers in this city were all civil rights advocates. They wrote a big book called Black Police Officers in Austin from 1871 to 1982. These were black police officers. They were civil rights people. They said, Nelson, in order to have community policing, we've got to talk to the police. We've got to create a process. People like Captain Louis White and Freddie Maxwell, who were equally police officers and civil rights people. We had that kind of balance. I was brought into that mindset. In 2003, a fellow named Jim Beck, who was a union president, said, Nelson, this is a very dangerous situation between the community and our leadership. Let's make a deal here. I don't dislike you, you don't dislike me. When there's a critical incident, I'm going to call you, and we're going to communicate before you say anything explosive to the public. 2003, you guys might not know Jim Beck. Changed the tone. Well, my point is that this involves everybody. When you talk about barriers to accountability, when you frame it in terms of a contract, you're really misleading the public, because we have a history and things that we have learned in this process. For example, 2004, we filed a Title VI complaint. We had our own database in Austin. That's not a part of the conversation. But here's a real problem. President Obama did an executive task force on 21st century policing. He was very, very clear with best practices. To address these issues, you need an effective city council that has the courage and the tough fortitude to address these concerns. You need a prosecutor who's going to be fair and make sure they address racial disparities. You need a police chief who is transparent and also enforces policies. You need civilian oversight, people who can compile data, not necessarily subpoena power, compile data and educate the public. You need a community that's responsive to these kinds of concerns. And finally, we have to all agree that we don't always agree. But we are committed to having a system that eradicates racial disparities. We need to have a fair system. That's the entire criminal justice process. Now, to the contrary, being completely transparent. In our budget, this city of Austin has never addressed racial disparities. Never have. We've called for it for the past 10 years to have a social service budget that address the origin of any of these problems. They haven't done that. And too often, it's put on the shoulders of police officers. That's not primarily their responsibility. It's a leadership issue in this city. Mayor, city council, everybody plays a role. We have to expand the horizon, look at our government, hold police accountable, but at the same time, make sure, like Acevedo said, that we invest in communities who have dealt with a disparate impact in economics in the city. We don't want to talk about that. So to make this about a contract and not address the entire budget, where you pit people against one another, I think is very destructive. We need leadership at the city level to force police officers, and us as well, to have a constructive conversation about where money goes and make sure we get the best contract possible, the best training possible, and finally, that everybody who has a stake, and we all do, is properly informed and educated how these issues evolve over a period of time and begin to embrace the best practices.
Nelson, I want to just summarize something that you mentioned there that we also talked about, I think, yesterday when we connected that I thought was interesting, which is, I think you said that you feel like the issue of racial inequity often gets argued through the police contract instead of city council perhaps looking at social, social things that they can fund to address that. And so I wanted to make sure I understood that that's what you were saying.
Well, sure. Let me give you, pretend this is the courtroom, and I have an eyewitness, who are very valuable, right? This morning, how many city council people are watching this conversation? My favorite one, by the way. I'm a little biased. I think we'll have a candidate here, Laura Morrison. Who else is here? And let me just be transparent, okay? Talking to these city council people, most of them are very uninformed about public safety and racial disparities. How can that be? If they're not going to have a conversation and educate themselves, they can't produce a contract that's fair and equitable. They can't even have a conversation about it. We're afraid to talk about racial disparities. We want to blame the police, and some of that's okay, but that's not the big issue. Everybody has a stake in this process. We need leadership to say, wait a minute, fellas, we can do better. And ladies, we can do better. And we're going to stand out, like Obama said, and address these issues ourselves to make sure everybody's at the table, not just blame people, but come up with a contract that makes the city better. And that's what I'm really saying. But again, you have to have leadership. And for some reason, we want to hide behind our doors in the city and make it police versus community. That's a very dangerous thing to do. And I can say that based on my own growth and evolution. If we don't address these issues head on and take responsibility, we can't solve these problems.
And Andrew, I wonder if you can touch on, how the police unions or officers' values have changed over time as we've been negotiating this contract every couple of years.
I think everybody gets into this line of work, wanting to serve the community. And so I think our values have remained constant. I think that technology and social media has changed, I think, people's perspective of our job and their perspective of how we should be judged. Too many times a snippet of video will come out of context and people will form a pretty unchangeable opinion about what happened, totally devoid of any conversation, any expert opinion about, or any context of how that situation came to be. And so I think that has played a role in in why we are maybe scrutinizing what we can do to ensure that the community is treated adequately. There are unfortunately times when people use police officers as a tool to end their own lives. They put us in a position where to protect ourselves or another party, we have to use deadly force. We don't want to do that. It's not a good experience for us. And that's something that unfortunately folks nowadays use as a tool to accomplish their own selfish mission. And we get judged harshly as a result of that when, you know, there's not a whole lot in those situations when they are so exigent that we can do. And one of the things I want to just say is, you know, Kathy mentioned that we have a high ratio of police shootings or critical incidents, and I just take issue with that statistic or framing that in a way that somehow the police are at fault. When I joined the police department 18 years ago, I swore to protect the community, and when I went through my training, they explained to me that I'm not a martyr. I didn't sign up in this job to die unnecessarily, and that I have a right to protect myself and to protect the community. And the city gave me a sidearm, and it gave me ammunition to go out and accomplish, those objectives. That is unfortunately, deadly force is a part of our job. It's a part of our reality, and I wish it wasn't. I wish I could go out there without a gun because nobody had a gun or nobody had a knife or nobody had a rock or any instrument that could kill somebody. I wish that was the reality that we lived in, but we don't. So to say that because there's a critical incident that somehow that is a negative statistic, it is unfortunate, and I wish they didn't happen, but we can't malign the police department because we gave them a task, we asked them to go out and do it, and then when they do it, we say, oh, that's a negative outcome, that's bad, you're a bad police department. I just think that's incredibly unfair. I think if you're going to take a look at the statistic of police shootings and try to come with some sort of a decision of whether or not the department is good or not, you have to look at every individual one of those shootings and determine if it was legal, if it was justified, if it was by policy. And when you exclude the ones that are, you might find that our ratio is not high. So I just want to make that clarification.
Kathy, did you want to respond? I wanted to give you a chance.
Yeah, I don't think you heard me laying blame. I think you heard me identifying a high rate of deaths in custody as a problem worth solving. And I think that part of what we're all doing here is identifying structural solutions. You mentioned police who shoot people who are trying to commit suicide. I think I share with you that the whole notion of suicide by cop should be an anathema. As a society, we should reject the idea that that is how we're going to handle mental illness or allow mental illness to play out. A lot of places don't really have that. Other countries, other policing systems, other mental health systems. And so, as you know, the Austin Justice Coalition has for a couple of years been promoting a number of ideas that address how we respond to mental health wellness checks. And I think that, again, our goal is to work out a system through our negotiations over the contract or separately, as Ron DeLorde has mentioned, where, an individual incident can be fairly assessed, and that is the oversight process. But we also want to look at the larger systems that we have in place and ask ourselves if they are the right systems or if we need to make change.
I really appreciate you clarifying that that statistic is not put out as an intent to malign. And I think it's fair to say that if we do have a high rate of critical incidents, it just goes to underline the danger that the men and women that put on a uniform and go out there to protect this community every day face. And so I do appreciate those words.
Ron, I wanted to just wrap back around to you and ask, in the years you've been negotiating these contracts across the state, have you noticed a change in conversation? Have you noticed any sort of trends or, similar things that communities across the state have been looking for or officers have been looking for in these contracts?
Well, as Samuel Gumper said, the founder of the American Federation of Labor, what does labor want? And they say more. Most people want to improve their wages and benefits. That's human nature. But I do think that we probably have, while we all argue about the difficulties of millennials and whoever the next generation, hiring, entertaining, leave, all the problems, well, we have the same things in our recruiting on the police side. And so the challenges we're facing, the upside is that we have probably one of the best educated, least discriminatory generations, people who grew up in a whole new world without a lot of the things that I saw growing up. So we're really getting a lot of good men and women who want to come. We just aren't getting enough of them to keep up with the demands, and that's a challenge we have on the policing side. But I just think that when we get out and talk among the officers, we're not getting backlash. Police officers in Austin are not coming to the association and saying, we don't want any oversight, we don't want any accountability. That's never come up. Now, you have, and it's hard to explain, you have the only really active oversight system in the whole state. I mean, people talk about Houston. It wasn't even close to what you had in Austin. There's none in Fort Worth, none for any real part in San Antonio, and most of the cities in the state have no outside oversight process. There are a few in the United States. So for 20 years, you've had a buy-in from the association. In the last round of bargaining, there were a couple of issues of which we could not agree on, but fundamentally, just about everything brought to us by the police monitor, we agreed with. We didn't see why the association should put up barriers to people who want to make complaints or put up barriers to protect officers who've committed misconduct. We believe they ought to have due process as any person, but we're not trying to keep people from being terminated or disciplined. It's a very, very tough business. You pay good money and you expect high quality from the officers, and we expect the same on our end. So when we look at bargaining from dealing with the Austin Police Association, we don't put up any barriers. If the city articulates this is our concern, then we try to resolve that concern in such a way that those who make mistakes, it's either corrective mistakes or it's mistakes of which they'll lose their job. But I'm actually positive about the future. I'm positive about the men and women that I'm seeing wanting to be officers. So anyway. Good.
Nelson, you wanted to respond, and then I wanted to get some.
Yeah, I want to mention both Andrew and Ron for a moment. We have to acknowledge, for example, that there have been incidences where the wrong tactics have been used, and this unfortunately happens too much in the black community. I'm going to mention to you the case of Jesse Owens in 2003, or Michael Clark, Corson in 2005. Those kind of cases like Nate Sanders, or most recently David Joseph, even Devin Contreras. These are cases that we can look at that are challenging. The problem is when an officer uses excessive force in a situation that appears to be affecting black and brown people, we have to address that. We talk about a contract, and that's fine, but I maintain if you use the right tactics, for example, more mental training, more self-defense, oftentimes in these situations, you can subdue folks without using deadly force. For example, in the most recent case we had in the city, in the shooting, the officers used less lethal force. We want to see more of that, even if it's not effective all the time. I guess my point is we can talk about the end result, but the incident's a problem. And I think oftentimes through federal training and higher standards, we can minimize the deadly force and teach officers how to engage people. Let's be honest about the language. De-escalation is really communication. And so if you're confident in your ability to deal with people in terms of conversation, in terms of self-defense, at least I am, there are things that we can do. We don't want you to risk your life. But some of these cases need to be condemned by the officers themselves. And I can tell you something, in every organization, The internal discipline plays a major role in how guys conduct themselves. You guys who are leaders, tell the young guys to be careful out there to arrest people. We're not talking about that, but that's what got us to this position in the first place. So while we can talk about a contract, it's the incidences that people remember. We have to stop some of this stuff and admit that we made a mistake, and that's okay, we're human, and make sure we have the highest possible standard. Cases like Garner, Tennessee versus Garner, the standards for Graham versus Connor. Those are cases that we have to study and understand. Now, I want to say again, we can talk about the end result, but if we can stop some of these cases when they appear on social media, whether we like it or not, things do happen. Until we address these things in an honest way and take some accountability, it's okay to admit mistakes. We're going to have these same conversations for the next 100 years.
Thanks, Nelson. Rebecca, I wanted to turn it to you and see what questions you've been seeing.
Yes, we've had a lot of really good questions. Thank you guys, and keep them coming. There's been a lot of questions around mental health wellness and the wellness checks. A two-part question, I put a few of them together. Number one is, how does this new contract, or as they're negotiating this new contract, is the mental health side of these wellness checks and the investment, is that supported in this new contract? So the investment in these mental health services. And secondly, are there evidence-based practices in responding to these mental health calls, and what are some of those practices that could be used, and would those be in the contract as well?
So I can reassure you, well, let me start with this. How we handle our calls, how we would handle a subject that's mentally ill is totally at the discretion of management. That's not something that the union feels needs to be negotiated at the table. We give the department absolute 100% control of the training that we receive, our protocol for handling different situations, and so we are agents of management in that regard. What I can tell you to dig a little deeper into that question is, what are we doing to ensure that our residents receive the resources that they get, whether it's police response, whether it's funding social health and welfare programs. And one of the things I want to talk about is that this last contract, we had that in mind from the get-go. As a matter of fact, our previous contract has reduced the fiscal footprint of the police department substantially as a ratio of salaries to the general fund. And this contract was going to do that as well. And so that's something that the union and the city staff, who I think did a really good job negotiating this contract that was not ratified by the council. I think that's something that we always take in mind when we sit down, is what is the community's priorities, and how do we still keep a safe city while allocating our money responsibly for other uses. For example, the statistic you cited at the beginning of this conversation was that we're 70% of the general fund. We've actually were 70% probably 2 or 3 years ago, but now we're down to 68%. So we've actually dropped almost a percentage point. Now that might not seem like a lot because it's a percentage point, but when you're $1 billion general fund, it's a substantial amount of money. So as a ratio of the general fund, public safety has shrunk over time. We were committed to continue to shrink over time. But I think this council, from what I heard them say on the dais, was that we hadn't shrunk enough or quick enough. And so from fiscal standpoint, they wanted to reallocate public safety dollars in another arena more aggressively than what was negotiated at the contract. And I understand their position. I think it's up to the community to decide those things, and they are the agent of the community.
Kathy, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I would just like to follow up. I think that is exactly right. Sort of figuring out a new way to handle mental health wellness checks and other kinds of, other things in the mental health wellness arena. Cross over to the contract only insofar as it is that thing I was sort of talking about earlier, where there's been I would call it a sea change in how the public thinks about public safety and how we as citizens would like to see our public safety dollars spent. And when you have a contract that represents a significant part of what is the most significant part of general revenue, that one opportunity that we have when the contract comes up is that opportunity to have a conversation about whether indeed this is how we want to spend our money. So the issue with mental health wellness checks is largely one of who, if armed police are not the right communicators with that person who's suicidal, who is, and we don't have those people right now, right? They are not on our staff today, and so we have to actually decide who those people are, what is the right approach, and then we have to hire them with money.
So let me just address that for a second, because I love where she's going, this idea of not sending police officers to mental health calls. And I think that that's something that we probably need to send to a progressive think tank, and they need to come back and figure out what the process is. Because when we discuss it amongst ourselves and say, okay, who can we send that's going to reduce the negative outcomes? Not jokingly, I said, send the firemen, right? Everybody loves a fireman. Nobody has any, they don't have guns.
They got a big truck.
I mean, everybody loves them. And when I brought this up with Bob Nix, I said, Bob, would you mind, because you guys, everybody loves you. You're all super fit, which means you have some free time to exercise. Love your cookbooks. Is there any way you could take these calls? And what they said was, yeah, we'd love to take these calls right after you go in and you make that scene safe.
There are actually models, as you know. Colorado Springs and Dallas is piloting something where the team includes a police officer for security, but is led differently, having it out of the fire department, having it out of EMS. There are alternatives, and they are actually being tried around the country. So it would be, this is the moment we have, right? We can look at those and we can actually have a real dialogue.
And those are totally at the discretion of the city, and I agree with that. And we're totally in step with wanting to reduce the negative outcomes of mental health calls. As somebody who's been a police officer 18 years, who has been in harm's way, who's also, right now, it's my responsibility to go out and go on scene when we have these outcomes that are unfortunate, and to see the impact that it has on these officers. It is a life-changing event for them, and it's not for the positive. And so we are 100% in step with any way that we could do to any solutions we have to reduce these negative outcomes. But again, even the solution that they're talking about still has an officer there and that's probably a good thing, because unfortunately, I don't know how our society has come to be that we have decided that this is an effective way to deal with our personal challenges, is to somehow put that responsibility of harming oneself onto a public servant. But it is just horrible. It's horrible all the way around, and it's especially horrible for the officers, the men and women that go out there and have to make these decisions in a moment of absolute fear for their own personal safety or the safety of others, and then to know that it really was because that individual fell through the community safety net. So I'm 100% in step with you on that.
And Nelson, I wanted to throw it to you, but I did want to, and I haven't done much reporting on this because I don't cover healthcare, but I do think Austin Travis County Integral Care has done some work with how when we have mental health calls, who gets sent out from them, and I know they've done some changes over the years. But Nelson, you wanted to add something?
I want to cite an actual case and an actual study. In 2002, when Sophia King was killed, it was a case of mental illness, but the day before she was killed, she was visited by a mental health officer. But at that point, it hadn't evolved. So a professor from UT named King Davis did an extensive study on that case in Austin, Texas. He gave it to the city of Austin. They declined to study the case. He sent it to San Antonio. They embraced it. My point is, I think we'll become accustomed to doing these studies, and my God, we have enough studies. Why don't we study these case studies where folks have lost their lives and talk about lessons learned? But in his assessment, and it's a sociological assessment, we need more of that for law enforcement, not just law enforcement, in general. If you understand these conditions, do you approach them differently? And if we can identify mental health in Sophia King in 2002, in Johnny Cannell in 1998, we can have an approach to that. The first thing is understanding. I don't think it's always sitting in a classroom taking notes. Hear these social experts talk about what to look for, how to fix you mentally, and how to prepare for that. And we're having case after case after case, even the day of mental illness. It's not just police. Our entire public safety system can recognize these incidents, communicate, and begin to do best practices. I just think overall, the key is going to be recognition. If you understand the problem, you can understand the solution. If you don't do the proper diagnosis, you certainly can't do a proper prognosis. So I think we need to go back and look at these cases in Austin, and there are lessons there that we can all learn from in terms of how we approach these situations. And I think if the approach is wrong, the result is going to be, unfortunately, detrimental.
Rebecca, another question?
Yes, I think this one's a really great one as we head into our last 15 minutes. So where are we now with the contract negotiations, and what are the next steps?
Well, we've had one preliminary meeting with the city. We have 3 set for the next 2 weeks. At this point, I guess we're waiting on the council and the mayor to give the new city manager some form of direction, because going back to December 13th, there appeared to be 11 varying opinions, none of which were more than we want to pay less and get more. I don't know what that means. So we want the city, the mayor and council to work with the manager, give the manager some direction for the city negotiating team. We have basically all the issues that we've already said. We know what the issues are. So if when the city brings that position to the table, then we're going to sit there and we're going to work on it. And as I've said before, I think it's pretty simple. What's simple is we know what the 2 or 3 issues are. They're complex as far as cost. And just one side note, it doesn't have to be either or. We either have well-paid and trained police, or we spend the money on other programs. We really have to have, I think both Kathy and Nelson have said it, is that you have to address the underlying problems. We've let the police end up with being the force of government on things of which they shouldn't be used for. And we've got a system of which we have no political will. The police have no control over immigration. They have no control over enforcing drug laws, homelessness, mental illness, poverty, social ills, but we're left to be that. And those issues can be dealt with politically. If they'll deal with those things, it'll take the burden off the police to not have to be the person that goes down there, particularly the case you mentioned on the lady that was killed in the housing deal. I believe her family had tried to have her get treatment multiple times. That incident would have never happened had we had a mental health system that would have helped that family. And I can name hundreds of cases where the family brought the police out because there was no other option, and those things ended tragically. So we're prepared to bargain. We've got an open mind. We have a good team, so we're waiting on the city.
From the officer's perspective, I can tell you that we liked having a contract because we felt like it offered us an understanding of our wages over a period of time. And I don't know if we've ever, maybe Ron can tell me, if we've ever even done a 5-year contract. I think the most we'd ever done before was a 4, but we explored a 5 because we knew that we wanted to have a contract that had pay in it that left room to hire the officers that we need to be able to implement community policing. And so that's another thing that we haven't really touched on today, but I just want to briefly discuss, which is, we right now our police department is staffed in a manner that our patrol officers are going from call to call to call, which means they don't have time to engage with their neighborhoods and have conversations not about business, not about a particular call. And I think that there is a belief in this nation, and as a police officer of 18 years, I've seen it myself. When you have time, the ability to get out and meet the folks in the communities you serve, then it goes a long way, not just to identifying and working on challenges in those communities, but it also helps you when you're in a moment of exigency, to maybe think outside the box of what resources could help you solve that particular problem. Now, how that relates to the contract is that we have always taken the fiscal impact of our wages, of our compensation, in regards to making sure that it left enough money, while also decreasing our ratio of salaries to the general fund, to be able to hire enough officers to allow us to community police. And so I think that, you know, that's a variable in the contract that we've always been aware of, that I think city staff that negotiated the contract with the union was very aware of. And I think that we absolutely would love to have a contract that allowed us to do all those things, to have what we all believe in is the most robust transparency and accountability system that meets all of our needs, and then also keeps the officers paid in a manner that allows them to be a part of this community, and still allows us to hire the officers we need to engage in community policing. One of the things I want to say, that just to end this, or my portion of this, is if you look at the community that we're in right now, it is the most vibrant, great city, and we're not perfect. I don't want anybody to think that my body of officers never makes mistakes, because we're human beings and we make mistakes and we will continue to make mistakes. But we have the processes in place, and hopefully we'll get the contract back to have even more processes, so that that we are a good department. And if you look at the city of Austin and how it has prospered over the last 20 years, I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that those two things are related. I think that the fact that we've had a stable, well-paid police department that has been respectful of the community but always striving to do better is why we have such a wonderful city.
The Austin NAACP supported Meet and Confer because it involves all of us and how we communicate in the city for better public safety. But also, a little history again. I love history, by the way. In 2002, I wasn't talking to the police president. We didn't like each other. We threw dots at each other all the time, and our community suffered. I've worked with Jim Beck, even Wayne Vincent. Pretty tough guy, by the way. Well, I think I am too. Ken Cassidy. We now communicate. We don't have to always agree, but there's a civil kind of respect for each other, and that means we get things done. We're not perfect, but we can talk to each other. I see this morning we have the Austin Police Manager here. I want to give her power back. And also, politically speaking, I see Laura Morrison here. When I looked at Meet and Confer and saw the loopholes there and the deficiencies and the mistakes politically, there was no leadership. If you read Laura Morrison's assessment about what happened, it was correct. We're on a football field. There's an offense and a defense. Every now and then you've got to throw the flag and say, look, I'm in charge. We need a referee to say, wait, you can get some of this and get some of that. At the end of the day, here's what we need. Because the stakes of a city that has the best police department in the country, potentially, is at stake. But it's not a police contract. It's our contract, and our goal is to make sure that we communicate, that we hold folks accountable, not just about civilian oversight. We got a deal here named Margaret Moore, who has one of the first civil rights divisions in the country. We don't talk about that. They can prosecute you, and they do have subpoena power. So I think my greatest frustration is we don't understand what we have. And if we don't address that, we're not going to go forward. But I will say there's room for improvement in the contract. I think these guys here will talk about it because now we are communicating. I think there's a way to go forward, but we can't do it without city council leadership. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, when people sit back and let people argue at each other and don't give any direction and leadership, that's a problem for me because my job depends on having leadership around me. I like being a civil rights guy. I don't like being a referee, frankly. That's not my skill. That's for the city council. If they can't say, wait a minute, you know, we can grow from this contract, we can cut revenues, we can look at other ways to invest in social disparities, we're going to be in trouble. We need both. We need to make sure the council addresses the larger issues of racial disparities in this city and quit talking about institutional racism. Where's the money? And also pay our officers and other folks in public safety for what they do. They do a great job overall. They're not perfect. I criticize them probably more than anybody. That's okay. I can handle it. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And every now and then, whether you like it or not, give folks a little credit for what they do and realize there's much work to be done.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up a little bit now. I only got about a third of the way through my question, so I appreciate you guys kind of discussing this at length, and I think we got to a lot of stuff. There's a ton more stuff we can talk about. But I want to, we like to end these breakfasts with a call to action. If someone wants to learn more about policing, learn more about the police contract, find out how they can weigh in on the police contract, from your perspective, how would they be able to do that?
Oh man, I've got the perfect thing for all of you in the room to do, which is to contact the police department. You can contact me. You can get my information through Leadership Boston. I'm an alum. And come do a ride out, okay? Give 10 of your hours, 8 of your hours, get in a police car with an officer. You got to sign a waiver, but we've never lost a rider. And spend time walking in our shoes and seeing what we deal with. It's something that I have asked council members to do, and the vast majority of them have done that, but some of them have not. And so please go out and do that. Ride in a police car with an officer. Get to know these wonderful folks who risk their lives for this community, and also see this city through their eyes and see the challenges that they face every day. Because if we are going to be a society that judges our officers, we owe it to them to have an understanding of what they face every day.
So I would just like to take this moment to invite you to participate with the Austin Justice Coalition in our efforts to improve the next contract and also to improve our system of police oversight. We have a policy group that meets every other week. We have a general meeting once a month that you can find easily on Facebook. We dig deep into this stuff, as these folks on the panel know. We're going to be talking in the nitty-gritty. The Austin Justice Coalition does, in fact, have somebody who sits at all of the meetings, and that's the role of, just so you know, the role of the public in the negotiation is to sit in a row of chairs against the wall at the back of the room and hope we understand everything that's going on in front of us. But we are always there, and we're paying attention and actually trying to move reforms through the process. So if that's something that's interesting to you, find me or just look us up on Facebook.
I want to invite each and every one of you to study the history of this city. It's recorded. Look at where we were and where we are, and think about how we can go forward. Realizing that this country has a thing called a Constitution. It's been amended many times to include black people and other people as well. You don't have to abolish the Constitution. You can amend the process. This contract can be amended for best practices. But I think our problem is 2/3 of the American people don't know the 3 branches of government. So I would say it's not just a black issue. Read your history. Learn from your mistakes. Know what we're talking about. Then read the contract. That way you can advocate for what's best. But you guys play a valuable role in this whole process, because it's not just a police contract. We're meeting and conferring, and we're communicating for a better city. I think we can do that. If Nelson Leonard can do it and learn, you wouldn't like me in 2000 at all, for a good reason. But I've grown. I've matured. It's bigger than me. Our kids are on these streets every day. That's what this is about. It's not about the organization. You know what the NACP is. I don't need to tell you that. But you are the NACP, because you have a responsibility to make this city fair and get a good contract. So ask the right questions, know the history, and we can all go forward. It's going to be tough, but I see Ms. Tovo, again, my favorite city council member, a lot of experience. I see not endorsing anybody this morning. I see Ms. Morrison, thank you. We have bright folks in this city, but you play the most important role because you're a voter. Claim your responsibility, embrace it, adopt it, and go forward.
Ron, did you want to add anything?
Because of the circumstances, we have a reset. I know there were groups that was their term, reboot, reset. Well, okay, we have. And now we have an opportunity to look at it. We're listening, and if you come to the negotiation session and you have a question, you're welcome to speak to the city side or to us at the breaks, and you can ask us. We'll tell you what we can tell you. You know, not everybody's going to tell you all of their strategy, but a lot of it's pretty apparent on the surface. So we're listening, and we have an open mind about achieving it. The best outcome will be that the vast majority of the officers believe it's fair, that the council and the mayor believe it's fair, and that the public and the community groups believe it's fair. It won't make there's no agreement that's going to make everyone happy, but we all want to achieve certain goals in this process, and we hope that we do that. So I'm very positive about it. I would tell you if I thought there was no way to get a contract. I believe that we all know we're just looking for that path right now, and I think we'll find it.
All right. Yep, Rebecca.
And I would like to go ahead and repeat kind of what I said at the beginning. If you are interested in public safety, if you are interested in any other commission on this great city of ours, please contact your city council person. There's a great form online to fill out your interest in any one of our city commissions. We have one representative per city council member and per the mayor. I sit on public safety. We have a 5-minute open communication from the citizens at the top of every meeting on the first Monday of every month at City Hall. If you're interested in speaking about a public safety concern in your neighborhood, please come and talk to us. We rarely have the time full up with people, and I would love to see that. Come sit through a meeting. We are also on the public TV channel, where they actually film all of our meetings, so you can go on and see the things that we talk about. And if you're interested, come and sit down and sit through a meeting. We'd love to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so know your history, go to one of these negotiations, go to the Austin Justice Coalition meetings if you're interested, go to a city council meeting. This contract will come back to the city council and people will be able to testify on it. So there's a couple of things. So
wait, you forgot the ride out.
Yes, and I've done ride outs, and they are very educational.
And we let you ride in the front. You ride in the front.
Yes, yeah. I've done that. All right, so let's give it up. Thank you so much to these panelists who came out early this morning.